So thank you very much for the invite. It's lovely to be in Belgium and we'll be talking about perspective taking again. And it was actually really nice to get an invite to talk about sort of broader scope of work. One of the nice things about it is it gives you a chance to sort of try and work out how loads of things you felt didn't really fit together sort of do. So broadly what I'm going to talk about today, what makes perspective taking easier or harder? So more specifically, probably things like what are the limits on what we can do easily and why sort of hard forms of perspective taking seem to be so much harder. And what drives a good chunk of this work is some ideas by Ian and Steve Butterfield that the sorts of things we call perspective taking, or maybe call perspective tracking at times as well, need to subserve a whole load of different abilities that have really different sorts of constraints and priorities. So if you're a cyclist in a sprint, people would commonly say you need to know if people can see you or not. You need to know potentially where somebody's going to move. You need to know if they see you, because otherwise you're just going to crash it. But actually, if you do that slowly, there's really no point in it, because everything's going to change. The decision needs to have been made by that time. Whereas if you're a chess player, or perhaps if you're somebody in the legal system making judgments about perspectives or intentions, there actually what matters is not necessarily your speed. What matters then, and what theory might be selected, there are processes which allow us to process as much information as possible. And so what we spent quite a lot of time thinking about really was the sense that if in social interaction, perspective taking needs to follow these kind of really quite different patterns, what sort of things allow it to do these different things at the same time, different times? And over the course of quite a long time now, we've looked at various different aspects of different things which might constrain what we can do quickly or efficiently or spontaneously, different things which might increase the difficulty of those things that might seem to be harder. And broadly, that's varied from things like visual differences, like age, to task level differences, to like nature of perspective taking, we're asking particular computational demands that fits with a lot of what Klaus was just talking about now, to subtler things like contextual differences, so who you're interacting with and how you're interacting with them at the time. These more sort of intra-individual differences, so as well as having these differences between people, as individuals, most of us notice that at sometimes we seem to be really in tune with other people, and other times we seem to find it massively difficult. And that's the sort of thing I've got more and more interested in recently, and the idea is that these are following a sort of broad continuum. So we have these sort of static differences, the way you can change your age is by getting older, which is quite hard to do deliberately, to these sort of more dynamic differences, these intra-individual differences, which, for instance, as a clinician, what you might be thinking about is these are the things which we might be able to help people change in their day-to-day lives. These might be the things we could work with health professionals about, how do they give themselves more time for appointments, do they make sure they're well rested, for instance. So most of what I'll talk about today relates to visuospatial perspective taking, so that broad sense of what does somebody else see, can they see something? And quite a chunk of early stuff relates to work by Dan Sampson and Ian and colleagues that looked at this avatar task that Caroline was talking about before. So I'll only talk about one study involving a level 1 version of this. The reason why I was particularly interested in this sort of task about 10 years ago really was a sense that it allowed us to look at those almost two different aspects of perspective taking. So one, which is the way I've more traditionally thought about things, what do you do if you get asked to do something that involves taking somebody else's perspective? What Dana's findings seem to show is that actually even adults who think we're good at this stuff are still quite egocentric, so we struggle to ignore somebody else's point of view. But also, on the other hand, when we take our own perspective, we seem to be spontaneously influenced by having somebody in that scene who sees things differently from us. Now, for my purposes now, it's not sort of massively important exactly what about that other person is influencing us. So you might call this cowardly, whether I'm making claims whether this is their mental state or not, but the general sense seems to be that even when you're judging your own perspective, that conflict makes things trickier. So in terms of age, we were kind of interested in sort of simple factors about, do 6-year-olds look like adults in this sort of task, because most people who've met 6-year-olds kind of think they won't. So hanging out with a 6-year-old, you realise that their social abilities are very different from adults' abilities. So our sort of strong prediction really is that you find these massive different patterns that might change over time. We thought this was quite cool because the earlier work sort of all focused on younger children really, and at what age children could first do things. When we asked sort of 6-year-olds upwards to make these self-judgments, so these are the judgments of whether you see a particular number of spots or not, what you find actually is really quite an alluring similarity of pattern over age. So 6-year-olds, in the same way as adults, are slower and they're less accurate at judging their own perspective if there's somebody there who sees something different from them. Similarly, I had a weird moment earlier in this week where I thought I'd copied the same graph, but they really are that similar. So when you're doing other perspective taking, again, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and adults all show this pattern. They're slower if perspectives are inconsistent than they are if they're consistent. And this actually, we never talked, I think, enough about this end of the results, but this to a degree goes against a lot of what we used to think about the difference between children's social abilities and adults, actually. We often talk about children being, I don't think it's just me talking about my children, but children being egocentric or children being wrapped up in their own world. Well, actually, that's really not the case here. But what's really noticeable is the sort of blindingly obvious thing that children are really slow and they make lots of errors at this stuff. So what I think I've never really talked about enough is that if you're going 3 times faster at this stuff, that's going to, in the real world, make a big difference to what you can do. So if you're going that much more slowly, you're going to make errors when you're put under time pressure that look like you're egocentric. But what is also really, I think, obviously clear is that this doesn't, to me, suggest something that's a purely social effect as well. When you judge your own perspective, you get exactly the same sort of speeding up through development time. So after that, we were thinking about whether different kinds of perspective taking were achievable equally easily. And I think I've looked out here by having everyone explain everything already. So Klaus really nicely explained the difference between level 1 and level 2 visual perspective taking. And essentially what we were interested in following that sort of level 1 data was to think, well, okay, is this sensitivity and this egocentrism something we also see in these harder types of perspective taking judgment in comparison to these sort of perspective tracking judgments? With all the reasons Klaus talked about, there's reasons to think that level 2 perspective taking might be more difficult. And what we showed, and these data are a little bit more complicated. These are the self data, so asking you what number you see in this picture. And the sort of key thing here really is it's only in this one over here on the bottom left that the little guy in the picture sees something different from you. So he sees a 6 there, while you see a 9. And what we showed on self-judgment was essentially no evidence of that sort of spontaneous level 2 perspective taking. So no extra difficulty in judging that this looks like a 9 to us 6 to it. And again, obviously, as we get older, we get massively quicker at this for self-judgment and for other judgments. But what hopefully will become clear here is in these other judgments, you also get a nice interaction. So you get this interaction effect, basically where this condition in the bottom left, where the location is on the table and he's looking at a number that looks different from the other side. Those are particularly difficult for everyone. So again, you have children here performing regularly over 2 seconds. The very youngest children really struggling to pass this sort of task regularly, and adults being much faster, but everyone struggling in particular with these trials where there's a perspective difference. So what we suggested in this week is that certain kinds of perspective taking are inherently difficult. So these level 2 perspective taking abilities seem to require something that's more complicated. They don't seem to have whatever cues it is that give us a kind of spontaneous sort of tracking ability. That's when we see something. And then we wanted to ask following that was, what makes these level 2 judgments hard? And Klaus's work here, where it came in really helpful with this idea already out there that there are these 2 different kinds of perspective taking process that we can employ to think about whether somebody can see something or not, and whether something is well. And our little contribution to this was to think, really, can we look to systematically vary both what sort of process might be employed and the degree to which something was a kind of sort of mentalistic visual judgment in comparison to a spatial judgment. So what we did was we showed people sets of stimuli that were very similar, and we had them do one of 4 tasks. So they either had to judge if he saw the number, what number he saw, whether it was in front of him or behind him, or whether it was to his left or to his right. And very much as Klaus has just explained, we manipulated the angular disparity between you and him. So the theory is, if you're really taking somebody's perspective, if you're really putting yourself in their shoes, that'll get more and more difficult as their perspective gets different from yours. And we varied bodily orientation as well. So either having a bodily position that was congruent or incongruent, person making judgments about a particular direction or how it's
Namely consistent.
I'd forgotten we'd even done that. But, yeah, and gone backwards there. So, and what we showed essentially was, in terms of overall performance, all 4 tasks vary greatly in terms of their difficulty. But the key thing I was wanting to kind of point out here really is that regardless of whether it's visual or spatial, you get these different patterns where some of these judgments seem to get more difficult with angular disparity, some don't. So if you're judging if something's in front of him or you can see it, and that doesn't get more difficult with angular disparity. Although in these particular stimuli, at least, you seem to be much faster at judging it in front of him versus whether you can see it or not. And regardless of whether you were judging it as something to the left or the right, what that number looked like, things got harder as that cognition difference increased. And again, nicely replicated Klaus's work, we found that the consistency of the body positions made a difference. So again, regardless of whether you're judging left or right or how somebody sees a number, that's easy to do if you're having consistent, congruent rotation to them. So it seems to be really the case that these cognitive processes are different for different kinds of visual spatial perspective taking. Some of these involve a truly kind of embodied process, imagining yourself in that position. But importantly, I think that's somewhat independent of whether this is something that we might do to get hold of somebody's mental state or not. So it really, those left-right judgments could be made for a blind person. The judgment would change. A blind person who might not even know that the block is there or not. Similarly, we don't have data from this particular task, but you could make those left-right judgments for a car or a chair, for instance. And my sort of gut prediction is you find similar results. So next, in terms of social interaction, we were quite influenced, I think, by a lot of the ideas about the difference between sort of second person and third person theory of mind at the time. So the difference in this case I'm talking about between making judgments about these sort of pictorial stimuli or puppets, story, versus actually perspective taking scenarios which require you to develop a relationship that's interacting. So what we did was developed a very similar version of the sort of 6-9 task, where instead of having people see lots of pictures on a computer screen, they took part in an experiment with a partner where there was a computer monitor sat on a table between them. They were told they were doing an experiment. Yeah, they were actually told they were playing a game, but I think it was an experiment. And on that computer monitor, a series of numbers flashed up. Half of those numbers were red, half of them were blue. They took one colour of numbers each. And the key difference, obviously, being that some of those numbers, like a number 8, the same to both people, but some, like a 6 or a 9, different to the two people. And all people had to do was judge the magnitude of the number, whether it was bigger or smaller than a 7. And in theory, because you're only ever judging your own perspective, and because we've said this sort of level 2 perspective taking is particularly hard, it requires this difficult embodied rotation. This is 180 degrees, which should be the very hardest thing to do. In theory, it shouldn't really matter what result you see, but in fact it does. So if you do this on your own, it doesn't matter what the number is like. But if you do this with somebody else, you are faster if they share your perspective. So what we wanted to say from this really is that even though these things seem to be inherently hard, that doesn't mean that you don't do them in a truly engaged, interactive situation. So if you're there taking part in a task that's framed as a joint task together, you will track something that is in theory hard to track. And we were talking about this at lunch as well, the sense that this had me really thinking quite a lot, in the sense that we spent so long trying to distill out the sort of sources of noise in these sorts of paradigms that I think we sometimes need to be careful about the sorts of implications we draw from the results, because actually putting people in a simple interactive context seems to change things so much. Then that really means we might be talking about different sorts of perspective taking going on in these different sorts of scenarios. So we've done various things following that task up, replicated it lots and lots of times now. It seems to be quite solid. But one of the things we wanted in particular to ask was whether the availability of cognitive resources made a difference there. So the thought was potentially maybe what you do when you're interacting, if you're doing something simple, you sort of free up some resources to take that person's perspective. Maybe that kind of ease of that task allows you to do that. So what we did was have the same task where, as well as making these judgments about what a number looked like to yourself, you had to hold in mind the number. So basically sort of blocked up your working memory, remembering a number, because you were going to have to do an arithmetic task afterwards. And the idea was this might stop people taking perspectives. And there's a slightly more complicated story that I'm not going to have time to talk about, but I guess the biggest finding was that certainly with what people did first, people became much slower if they were doing a dual task as well, so 200 or 300 milliseconds slower on average, but still showing that consistency effect. So even if you're holding something in your memory, you still seem to be sensitive to your partner's perspective. So last of all, in terms of the current state stuff, which is what I'm doing a lot of work on at the moment, we've been interested in the influence of things like anxiety and sleep deprivation on perspective taking. So the idea that these sorts of everyday experience that lots of us experience, but actually in almost all kind of psychiatric disorders, these things kind of have a component as well, might influence our ability to think about other people efficiently, might impact how hard certain kinds of perspectives are. And the thoughts of comparing anxiety and sleep deprivation, which seem like really quite different things, came out of the sense that these things seem to have a different sort of signature when we looked at level 1 visual perspective. So this is work by Gaëtan Bellion here in Brussels. And what Gaëtan really nice to show was that for level 1 perspective taking in particular, if you were sleep deprived, you became basically rubbish at ignoring a discrepant perspective. So it didn't matter if it's self or other, what you got bad at was selecting between those perspectives. Whereas when you're anxious, and data from Anthony Todd and Austin Simpson have showed a really different pattern. So actually on the other perspective taking judgments, you get a really similar pattern. So you get worse at ignoring your own perspective to judge somebody else's. But for self perspective taking, you actually get better at ignoring the discrepant perspective. So looked at in comparison, you have this nice pattern. You have something like anxiety, where you get this bias towards self over other perspective, which is really interesting in relation to some of Francois' work earlier, talking about that kind of uncertainty aspect, is how we're sort of understanding that in relation to anxiety. Whereas sleep deprivation, you get this sort of increased difficulty with deciding between discrepant perspectives. And what we like to argue is that this sort of stuff is actually some of the most important stuff to understand and think about if we're thinking about kind of sort of, I guess, clinical approaches to these things. Because actually these are things that you can do things about. So you can make a difference to how anxious you might expect a person to be in a social situation. You can essentially improve somebody's sleep to allow them to do things. And what you might also want to do, though, is I guess try and ameliorate the effects of these things in different ways. So do you try and increase somebody's focus on one perspective over the other, or do you give them extra time to resolve differences between perspectives? So one last quick study that slightly complicates the anxiety findings, unfortunately. So we're in our own work trying to sort of extend and understand whether these are sort of broader impacts of things like anxiety. So we've been trying to see if the effects from that level one visual perspective taking task sort of cross-pollinate and look the same in different sorts of tasks. So this is work by Henry Briscoe that used the thirsty and hard paradigm. So basically in this one, you have to describe the relationship between the book and the bottle, and there's a person there. And what people tend to do is, even though you're not asked to take his perspective, you tend to use him in your descriptions of where the objects are. And what Henry was interested in was whether that would be influenced by anxiety. So the thought being from the kind of Todd stuff that we would see people being more egocentric when anxious, so less likely to make those other related descriptions. And Henry was also interested in how ethnicity affected this. So whether any effects of anxiety would be influenced by making a judgment about simply your own ethnicity versus someone else's. So this was right in the middle of Black Lives Matter stuff. I think he was sort of trying to, I guess, have some ideas that might help us understand some of this sort of political as well. And interestingly, what he showed, and we're just replicating this at the moment, was that when people were, well, basically we got an interaction, and when people were relaxed, there wasn't a significant difference between own versus other ethnicity judgments. When people were anxious, there was. So when anxious, what people seemed to do was make either more outer-centric and more neutral responses for their own race. So it seemed to be when you were anxious, people were more prepared to think about points of view that weren't their own, or simply your own race. Whereas for somebody of a different race, we seem to see the opposite happen. So people who were anxious and thinking about another race were more focused on these egocentric judgments. So one sort of conclusion from this is that, you know, I am getting more and more hesitant about whether we'll see a general pattern of the influence of something like anxiety or sleep deprivation on perspective taking or social understanding, meaning that if we're going to make these claims, we need to be thinking about a variety of different tasks and how these things might affect us sort of cognitively as well as socially. But it does seem to make a difference. So there's no particular reason why it necessarily should, but it does seem to matter. And those sorts of things, when people are having to regularly make these social perspective taking judgments, if anxiety is sort of interacting in that way with ethnicity, that's really important to know, actually. So just to sum up, really, my sense is that all of these sorts of differences, be they static or more dynamic, have an influence on the sorts of perspective taking judgments we can do sort of spontaneously or easily, and they all likely interact as well. So when you sort of quite a lot of complex factors here, and I genuinely think that we can have a habit, I suppose, of drawing conclusions within one of these frames and assuming they hold more broadly. And I think it's all going to matter. So from the level of differences between individuals, the differences in contexts and dyads, right down to what's happened to a person in a particular situation. And actually, I think, or my sort of gut feeling at the moment is where we can make more difference is probably in this stuff down in the bottom, actually. But we can't necessarily make any adjustments for somebody's age necessarily. We certainly can't change their age in an interactive scenario. What you can do is think about the sorts of, I guess, settings, the sorts of kind of dyadic relationships, and the sorts of intra-individual dispositions somebody might experience certain social judgments or perspective taking judgments in. So thank you very much for listening. These people all collaborated on one or more of the studies, and these people funded.
Thank you for the talk. The last experiment seemed to show, so my understanding of the orthodoxy with a small o of the in-group out-group effect in relation to perspective taking is that we're more accurate when someone is out-group. But your data seems to suggest that people are more egocentric when someone is out-group. I just wondered if you had an explanation. I mean, I don't take a view either way. No pun intended. Do you have an explanation for that?
A partial one. So I think my gut feeling is that it depends on the sort of perspective taking you're thinking about. So you're very much talking about accuracy there. So there's no accurate or inaccurate response here. My suspicion is that this fits more closely to an implicit bias rather than a sort of accuracy element. So I think my understanding of the accuracy data would be the sense that if somebody's in group, you assume they're like you, and you buy them your freebie box if that's what you want. Whereas if somebody's out group, you make a judgment based on the information you have about them, and that makes you more accurate. Whereas here it's a question of, do I give them relevance? Do I give them importance? Because all I've been asked to make a judgment on is something spatial. And so that would be my, I didn't predict they'd go this way, but that would be why they would. I think.
Makes sense.
Well, thanks, Andy, for confirming that we're all racist.
You weren't one of my participants, Wes.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, I was completely egocentric, 100%, no doubt about that. But it's really interesting to see the whole work coming together, and also your work on the interactive context. So there seems to be variables that are in the perspective taker, and there are variables that are in the target perspective, and there are variables that are in the context. And basically, so we might not necessarily want to think about sort of different forms of perspective taking, or which variables bias which selection of frame of reference, if you like, and not generally frame of reference for what type of judgments where the tasks are coming in. So I think all this, also the racial biases come in, so they create a certain situation, as you eloquently explained. Basically, the interactive context, it creates a certain context. There are data also showing that if you, it was superiority, basically, so sort of similar to what Ian was doing, basically. So, or, I don't know, it was, sorry. Basically, so in terms of social hierarchy, there will also be other variables that will influence which frame of reference you pick. You're more likely to pick your own or the other person's, or one objectively different. For instance, if there is a directed object, you can use that to communicate about its left from the car's left and the car's front, rather than have to choose between you or I. So very interesting, but this fuels the discussion, I would think.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think it's certainly something that's changed in my thinking over the last sort of decade or so. I think at the start of all that, I think my main thought was right. You will find the kinds of perspective taking that are efficient, automatic, spontaneous, and the kinds that are difficult. And in reality, I think there is just this whole range of messy, interactive factors. And so Henry's got some nice work on sometimes the difference between the target you're judging about as well as yourself. And I think this nothing he is even getting into things like the competition and cooperation, whether you have a friendship with a person or not. And my suspicion is that all of those things are at least candidates to moderate these relationships.